Here we are. James, another great album. I've been talking about Will in Rock Hard in Greece since your previous album. I hadn't heard the first one when it was out, and I thought it was really a killer. But this time,
Thank you
I
very
think
much.
you surpass yourself. I think with Charismatic Leaders. Uh, can you tell me which are the things that are different now that you are signed for Inside Out instead of OMN label services? That's quite a huge change.
Yeah, it is. I mean, first up, so OMN Label Services are the label services of our management company, of course, and so everything we did up to that point was in-house for the release for Moving Backwards and Resident Human, and I was kind of blown away how far we got just working that way. Like we got to #3 in the Australian rock chart with Resident Human, which we really didn't think was a possibility. Um, but of course, it was a small team of people, and compared to the resources of Inside Out, they don't have the same amount of resources. So I think the biggest difference is, firstly, it's budget. We've had a much bigger budget to make the record with, and there's a much larger team promoting the album than we've had previously. I think we had 3 PR agents with Resident Human. We had somebody specifically for France, we had someone for Finland, and then we had someone else doing the entire rest of the world. Whereas this time, I think we've got 6 or possibly even 7 different people working on various territories, promoting the album and making sure we get as many interviews as possible. And even in terms of social media, like we've always tried to do our own thing with that and find our own way to communicate with people. But they've got so much experience using social media to market tours and albums that we've learned a lot just watching how they do it and taking the bits we like and using it for our own purposes.
Do you live in Finland?
Yeah, I've been here for 12, no, how long? Nearly 14 years. God, that's terrifying.
uh, so it's Englishman in Finland, not Englishman in New York.
Yeah, New York seemed expensive, so I came here instead.
Yeah. Which are the charismatic leaders you refer to in your album title?
So traditionally, charismatic leader is a technical term to describe the head of a cult. It's a certain style of behavior and manipulation. Um, Things like keeping people so busy they can't think, and superficial charm, um, and high levels of narcissism, of course. And I started to see a pattern pretty much from when I wrote Moving Backwards up to now, where that term, the meaning, in my opinion, is beginning to change. It doesn't only refer now to cult leaders. I think we see it in politics. I think that's the most obvious one. But we see it in popular culture. We see it in branding. A really good example is Apple. If you criticize an Apple product, people defend it like you've insulted their children. And without judging people at all, I think it's just an interesting phenomenon that we tend to default to these tribal behaviors, and we turn everything into an us and a them, and we kind of take some of our personal identity from these external factors. So I think it's kind of bizarre, isn't it, that so many different parts of life have taken a card from the cult leader playbook, but it feels like these means are becoming more and more normalized as time goes on. And you can make an argument that's happened throughout history in various shapes and forms, but just because of the internet, it's happening so much faster than it ever has before, and the change is so rapid.
Do you feel that this kind of manipulation from charismatic, in quotation marks, leaders comes also from the media or the social media as well?
Absolutely, yeah. I think every media company has an agenda, and I think even the best of them clearly are much less transparent than we'd like to pretend they are. Like BBC is a good example. I love the BBC as a British guy, and I grew up really trusting the kind of relatively neutral stance that they had compared to many other media outlets in the UK. Um, but it came out fairly recently that the one of the CEOs of the company was basically appointed by a prime minister, and had to resign as part of a scandal. So they're not infallible either. Um, and I think, like many other people, I'm very aware of how imperfect these organizations are, and I try and take what they say with a pinch of salt. But I think when you're bombarded with enough information, it still changes us, and it changes our global perception of what's happening around us. Um, I think, like I wrote about in Empire, we end up turning people who disagree with us into a caricature of all of the worst traits of the people that we perceive as the other side. So for example, it's really easy to reduce. I'm relatively liberal, I guess, in my views. Um, I say relatively because I've met some people who are way, way out there on the left, and I don't really agree with them. But when you hear about people on the right, it's really easy to reduce them all to a bunch of drooling idiots who want guns and to take away all of women's rights and roll us back to a state of, a 1920s family mentality. And that's completely inaccurate. Like, if I think about everybody I've met in my life, maybe I've met one person ever who seems to kind of conform to that version, this stereotype of these viewpoints. And it's very subtle the way this has changed. It feels like the main purpose of media these days is to enrage us, because that drives engagement, and that's the metric that all these companies use to determine its value. And it really takes a lot of willpower and self-reflection and humility to kind of go, okay, how I'm feeling at the moment, this is irrational. Actually, this is probably how things actually are. So I'm not above it any more than anybody else is. I think a really great example would be the COVID pandemic. And during that time when people were talking about vaccines, I was 100% pro-vaccines, and I was really pissed off with people who weren't taking it because it shut down my whole industry. And I was deeply frustrated that it wasn't faster getting back to normal. But more recently, in the last year, I've met a young woman who took the vaccine and ended up with tons of allergies and really bad skin problems as a consequence for this. And that this isn't me saying, therefore, I believe the complete opposite. That's exactly the point I'm trying to make. There is some nuance to this. It's not a one or a zero. And I think some kind of nuanced debate is really important, particularly when we're talking about world-changing policy like the COVID pandemic. And it was quite humbling to realize that I've been swept up in this as well, just thinking this was an absolutist thing when, of course, it wasn't.
Mhm. Your albums balance between the gigantic over 10-minute songs and the more compact 4 5 minute ones. Which kind of songs do you enjoy more to perform and write?
I think they both present different challenges, and it all depends on what the starting point is, at least as because I mean I write most of our music. I think sometimes you get an idea and think this has a huge amount of distance I can get from it. This could be a really big piece of music. And other times you get something and just think this one, a good example would be Disciple on the latest album. I mean, that's pretty much got one core idea throughout the song. And that felt like it would be a really good, concise piece of music. Or Empire, where it's like a really short, sharp kind of punch in the jaw rather than this longer, more elaborate construction. I love making the big songs. That's what drew me to prog in the first place. But at the same time, I think is a really fun challenge trying to condense what Wheel has become into a 4 or 5 minute piece of music. And it's really satisfying when we pull that off. And in terms of my favorite stuff we've done, there's a real range from the shorter stuff like Synchronize and our last EP. That was interesting because we hadn't done that before. To something like Dissipating, which was very, very elaborate and took a really long time to put together. So I think it all has merit. I always thought prog just meant that there aren't any rules and you can kind of try all of these different things. And I think trying to tie all of that together under one umbrella in an album, that's quite a fun challenge as well.
Yeah, mentioning the
Excuse me.
mentioning the song Empire. What made you move in a more metal direction and even start the song, the album, with a kind of frenetic song like Empire? It's totally unusual for a Will.
I think for the I guess we kind of did it with Moving Backwards. I think Vultures was quite intense, just not quite as intense as Empire. Um, but I think it was just the ideas we had when we started making the album at the beginning of last year, when I really got into the writing part. We had some ideas already kind of saved in a folder somewhere. So we had the two main riffs from Empire. We had the first 3 minutes of Submission. We had the core riff from Disciple. But we had the verse part from Saboteur, and all of these ideas were pretty damn heavy. So it just looked right from the start. This is going to be a heavier album than Resident Human was. And also just in terms of production style, moving backwards, we really didn't know what we wanted. It was the first time we'd made something that big. So we just kind of did what came naturally. Then we toured loads after that because we started getting these wonderful opportunities with Soen and Catatonia to travel around Europe. And we got really used to how the band sounded live. So Resident Human, we wanted to sound closer to that live sound. So it was kind of underproduced deliberately so. And this feels like it's somewhere in the middle now. We've kind of got the industrial intensity from moving backwards, but it's still got the liveliness from Resident Human. We've kind of found it somewhere in the middle. And that went into the production side as well. We recorded all the instruments in Sweden with Daniel Bergstrand and Frederick Fordendahl from Meshuggah. And both of those guys, Frederick owns a company called Toontrack, who make drum software, so like samples that you can write drums with on a keyboard. And I've been writing with that software pretty much since I started making music, or not too much long after that anyway. So we were pretty certain this was where to go to record great drums, and both of them had very metal taste. So in between kind of Sanfeli's, our drummer, his aesthetic, and what the desire they had on the production side, hearing the material, the way they wanted it to go, all of it just ended up feeling kind of grittier and more metal than the previous album. I think that was balanced extremely well by Forrester Savile's mixing, which it smoothed it out in a way. It kept the heaviness, but it also added kind of space and depth to it. So I think it's greater than the sum of its parts, and I think all of them left their own mark on it, which ended up being pretty metal.
Yeah, mentioning Daniel Bergstrand, you told me the reasons why you worked with him. However, he's a producer more well known for working with bands like Meshuggah, like Dimmu Borgir, like In Flames, like Soulwork. And the only band that comes closer to you from his roster is Pain of Salvation. Did you have any second thoughts? Did you have any second thoughts before working with Daniel? Because he hasn't done so much. He hasn't worked with so many bands like Will.
I think that was part of the appeal, to be honest. I think it's really difficult not to follow the path best trodden when you're in a stylistic niche. So, for example, whatever prog metal means, it's kind of a broad term. You know, you've got Meshuggah and Dream Theater under the same label, so you know it means what you think it means. But we kind of want to find our own thing and our own language, and I think there was just something in the aggression of the sounds of the stuff Daniel's worked on previously that really spoke to us. And of course, Forrester as well, who we've worked with previously in the last EP, who ended up mixing the record. We already had quite a fairly good idea of how we wanted the aesthetic of the sound to be right from the start. But I think the most fun part about doing albums is you always learn something new about how various producers and engineers approach just technical problems or aesthetic design within sound itself. For example, I've quad tracked guitars, rhythm guitars on basically everything we've ever done. And for the uninitiated, that means quad, you record 4 rhythm tracks that are exactly the same. You have 2 on the left, you have 2 on the right, and that makes the body of the sound. On this album, we double tracked everything. So we only did 2 of those tracks. That was Daniel's idea. And to be honest, I wasn't sure that was going to work. I just kind of went with it and thought, hey, you know, you've got to trust and see where it goes. And it has changed the feeling of the rhythm guitars on this record, that they're a bit less, they feel a bit more organic and a bit more real and less maybe a bit less wide in places, in a way that I think really suits the music. There's a lot of information happening. There are multiple polyrhythms all the time. I think it's ended up making the rhythm guitars feel a bit more focused and maybe easier to identify in the mix. So sometimes less is more, and that was quite an interesting learning curve.
Mhm. The tool influence might be obvious, but there are many more things other than that. Were you influenced by the bands that you toured in the previous years, like Soen, like Catatonia, I can say Epica, but which other bands are or were your idols while creating music?
I think when I was younger, that the big three for me were Tool, obviously, Meshuggah and Carnival. I just really resonated with what they were doing, but in smaller but equally significant ways, I love Radiohead. I'm a huge fan of their, well, just everything they've ever done. I think they haven't released a bad track. I could say the same for Alice in Chains and Soundgarden, and and multiple other groups kind of in that field. This kind of grungy, nasty stuff from the 90s. Like I think the Nirvana records, all of them apart from Nevermind, I love the sound. It's just so nasty. And there's all this feedback and chaos happening. There's the tempos are really loose in a really nice way. Um, I think we just tried to wrap all of that up under its own umbrella, and of course the other musicians in the band. Excuse me. Our drummer is a massive Mars Volta fan, and he's a trained jazz drummer. So we're always a bit scared of putting anything jazzy into the music because we don't want to end up with stuff sounding pretentious. Because I think it's really easy to just get lost inside your own butthole and lose some of that. But I think in the Freeze, for example, I think the jazzy elements he's incorporated there, it's really unusual. It's not like something I've heard a drummer do before. Um, but we just keep trying to find new colors we can add to the palette, but still feel like it's part of Wheel. Because as you say, I mean, yeah, no shit, we've heard of Tool before and we're inspired by them, but that's just one of many, many bands that have inspired us to make this music. And the longer we do it, I think the more clear to us it's becoming kind of what our stylistic umbrella is and what fits it and what doesn't. Uh, and the nice thing about prog is there's not really an end in sight for that. Like I've still got a long-term ambition to do more stuff with synthesizers in the music, and I don't think we're going to end up with a Kraftwerk style album or anything. But that there are so many cool choices you can make with this stuff with modern technology. Like Leprous is a great example. You listen to Sky is Red, the synthesizers in that song, they're awesome. It's so aggressive and unique sounding. I think there are tons of cool options and particularly the cynics who are saying, guitar is dead and there's nothing new that can be done with the instrument. I don't buy that for a second. I think it's like saying the paintbrush is dead. It's just a tool. It's what you do with it, and I think it's really fun finding new ways to kind of present these basic elements.
How do you see the invasion of AI in music?
I've got mixed feelings about it. I think the good side is that it's going to mean there are new kinds of music that are created and it's going to become more accessible. And especially for new artists, I think all of the technology you can use now, it's so affordable and so easy to get into. You can watch some YouTube videos teaching you how to use music software, which is how I learned. I learned Pro Tools from YouTube videos. Um, and at the same time, I think the idea that music will be completely displaced by AI anytime soon is quite unrealistic. It's going to require a person to vet it and to say, yep, this one's good, this isn't, maybe we should change it like this. And that comes down to taste and experience still. Sorry. Um, but I think also that there is something frightening about it. I just always think back to the Industrial Revolution in the UK, where we had the Luddites going around smashing up machines with sticks because they thought their careers were going to be ended. And in a way, they were right. Like one person sewing a hat can't really compete with a machine making 100 of them an hour. But it created many new opportunities in its own right. And I think for modern composers, but considering how I make songs, where I generate a series of ideas and ones that correlate, then I'll assemble them into these bigger, elaborate things. you end up to what is creation? Is it creation if an AI generates some of those ideas and then you find really interesting things to do with them? And I'd argue that is still art. That's basically what people are doing with sampling now. Like if you look at Daft Punk, for example, they've done really interesting things where they've chopped up these old soul records and they've repurposed them into very interesting sounding compositions. Um, I think it's frightening because it's new, and I think the most frightening thing about it is after seeing the absolute failure of regulation for social media, the hopes that our governments are going to understand this technology well enough to regulate it. I just have very close to zero hope that's going to be done well. Because people don't understand the tech. Like, I mean, we barely understand it, and you know, this is happening on our watch in our generations. If you think about people in their 80s in Parliament, I don't really trust their ability to do anything smart with it. But time will tell. I think there's going to be good, there's going to be bad with it, like there is with everything.
How do you see the almost inevitable use of streaming services for music? Has it altered the way that you write music and act as musicians?
I don't think it's changed the way that personally I write it. I think we're actually one of the kind of bands that benefit the least from streaming services. Like if you wanted to be a cold-hearted capitalist, the best streaming album you could make would be a 60-minute album of 1-minute songs because artists get paid per stream. And if you release those as singles across the year, you get very regular promotion on that work. Whereas our music, we end up with nearly an hour of music and it's 7 songs. So we don't really benefit that much from that. I think maybe not so much for us, but definitely for future artists. You have to be pragmatic about this stuff. The income streams that bands used to use to survive are just they're decimated. Even ones you thought wouldn't be touched, like merchandise, for example. Without naming and shaming venues, we played in a venue last year where they took 30% commission on our merchandise sales. And my jaw was just on the floor. Like, just how can you justify this? You know, you're getting a share of the ticket sales, you're getting the bar, and on top of that, you want a share of our merch money, which is pretty much the only place we make anything on the road. And the costs are extremely high. Like going out on tour for a new band, it costs you tens of thousands of euros, and you've got to come up with that money from somewhere. So I guess pragmatic bands in the future, they're always looking at where to cut costs. I know, for example, Radiohead have said publicly several times that they really take issue with bands who use backing tracks live, for example. They think, you know, if you can't, they've been very nice about it, the way they've worded it, but like it's somehow less if you don't have somebody on stage playing every part of a live performance. And to be fair, that's pretty much impossible for some bands now, unless you're literally, you know, Coldplay size or something, where you have a bottomless budget for this stuff. You've got to, if you want to tour and play that music, you've got to make some concessions somewhere. And backing tracks have become essential for some bands doing it that way. So I think there is still room for creativity with this, and we're seeing it with a lot of young artists, and especially in scenes like grime and hip hop. You look at some of the videos that young UK rappers are making now on very small budgets, and they're excellent. Just creative people with a nice camera and just a simple idea for a video. Normally just them rapping, but with a really cool presentation. I think it's the days of MTV and 7-figure budgets for videos. They're long behind us, and this is what the modern landscape looks like. I think my only fear with this is I wrote a lot about Hyperion Cantos in our last album, this wonderful science fiction novel by Dan Simmons. And there's a character in that, Martin Silenus, who writes this beautiful book of poetry that he really suffers to create. And he shows it to the editor. The editor loves it and starts crying and says, "This is wonderful. No one's going to buy it." And they're right. No one does. I think it's changing the appetite that we have for arts. And I also think the expectations we have for releases are changing. For example, if you look at the album cycles that happened in the 90s, which might be sometimes 4, 5, 6 years between albums, that's completely unfeasible now. If you're a newer band, you need to release something more or less every 2 years. And if you don't, you lose that streaming favorability, that placement, and you become yesterday's news. So will it change art in the long run? I really don't know. I think in some way, yes, it's just a question of how severe will that change be. I'm a cautious optimist. I think that there was a great quote I read recently where we always think we're living in the end times, and we think that our parents' generation thought that with the Cold War. There'll be something new that comes up as well. So I'm pretty sure this isn't the end, and there'll be something cool and new that happens.
Speaking about new things, you have a tour that I really wanted to see with Caligula's horse in Australia. You have planned tours in America and Europe. Can you tell us more about your plans and what do you expect from the release of Charismatic Leaders?
Well, obviously we really like the album. I think it's like you say, I think it's the best one we've done. So I'm expecting it's going to be very popular when it comes out, at least by our standards as a band making really nerdy prog. But we have it's going to be our first trip to Australia, which we're super excited to do. And selfishly, I get to watch Caligula's horse play live, which I'm really looking forward to because I haven't seen them before. Then we're doing our first headline tour in America and in Canada, which that's new for us. That's really exciting. Um, and the support band we have for that, Aviations, they are wonderful. Ever since I discovered them, I think their album they released last year, I think it's Luminaria, is exceptional, and that's going to be really fun to see live. And bear in mind, we have done a lot of support tours. Like nearly everything we've ever done has been a support tour. So getting to go out and play a longer set and treat the gig kind of differently. If we get a half an hour to 40 minutes slot, that's 4 or 5 songs for us because so much of the material is really long. So this time around, we get to play a bit more of an eclectic mix from across our discography. So it's a really fun challenge, and we spent a lot of time in the rehearsal room this past month just grinding out the new set and making sure it's in shape for when we go on tour. Then, of course, at the end of the year, we're doing a headline run in Europe with Molly Baron, which we're really, really excited to do as well. But I just think it's going to be a great year for us. I think a question someone asked me not too long ago was, what is the point? You kind of think, yeah, you've made it now, whatever the hell that means. And from the start, we've just wanted to be able to support ourselves and make music that we like, and anything beyond that we see as a bonus. And even though, of course, like everyone else in other jobs, we've got our own battles and our own problems we deal with. I think this is more or less it. We're getting to do the music that we want to play, and we're getting to tour with some great acts. We're just incredibly grateful we get to be here at all.